A black U.S. military officer faces discrimination on a flight, but justice prevails. The hum of the airport was familiar yet restless. People rushed from one gate to another, voices blending into a sea of movement and announcements. Captain James Carter, dressed in his neatly pressed U.S. military uniform, stood near his boarding gate, quietly observing the scene. He had spent years serving his country, had seen the world in ways few could imagine, yet at this moment, all he wanted was to return home. The airline attendant at the counter barely glanced up when he handed over his ticket. "Economy, seat 23B, she murmured, stamping the paper before sliding it back. He nodded, tucking the ticket into his breast pocket before stepping aside. James had never cared for special treatment. In fact, he preferred to blend in. But in his experience, blending in wasn't always a choice. A voice, warm and cheerful, interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, are you flying with us today?" James turned to see a young flight attendant smiling at him. She was in her mid-20s, with bright eyes and a genuine kindness that was rare to find in a place where people came and went without so much as a second glance. Her name tag read Mary. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, tipping his head respectfully. "Well, we have an extra seat in first class, and I'd love to upgrade you," she said excitedly. "It's just a small way of saying thank you for your service." James chuckled, shaking his head. "That's mighty kind of you, miss, but I'm just fine where I'm at." "Oh, come on," she urged, her enthusiasm almost contagious. "It's not every day I get to thank someone like you. Please, let me do this." He hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who took favors easily, but something about her sincerity made him pause. "Well," he sighed, relenting with a small smile, "I suppose if it's not too much trouble." Mary's grin widened. "Not at all, sir. Let me take care of that for you." A few minutes later, James had a new ticket in hand, first class, seat 4A. As he boarded, he nodded at Mary in thanks. She beamed back, clearly pleased with herself. The first-class cabin was quieter, filled with plush seats and passengers who barely noticed as he took his place. James settled in, stretching out his legs for the first time in hours. He sighed, allowing himself this small comfort. That peace didn't last long. A sharp voice broke through the calm. "Excuse me, what is going on here?" A middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform stormed down the aisle, her expression tight with disapproval. The badge on her chest read Ms. Harrison, Chief Flight Attendant. James glanced up as she stopped beside him, her gaze flicking between him and his ticket, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Ms. Harrison ignored him and turned to Mary instead. "Why is he in this seat?" Mary, standing just a few feet away, straightened her posture. "I upgraded him, ma'am. He's a military officer, and I thought." "You thought?" Ms. Harrison cut in sharply. "That is not how things work on this flight. First-class upgrades are for paying customers, not handouts." James felt the shift in the air. The quiet murmurs of passengers nearby, the way eyes flickered toward him before quickly looking away. Mary swallowed hard. "But ma'am, we had an open seat, and it's a small way to show appreciation." Ms. Harrison's tone turned ice cold. "Do not make decisions that are above your pay grade, Mary. We have standards on this airline, and certain expectations for who belongs up here." There it was. The unspoken truth wrapped in sharp professionalism. James sat still, his grip tightening on the armrest. He had faced worse than this. He had been in war zones, seen men at their worst and their best, but somehow, this small moment burned differently. Then, as if fate had intervened, another passenger spoke up. "Excuse me," a man in his 50s, well-dressed with a neatly folded newspaper in his lap, called out. "I couldn't help but overhear." James turned toward him. The man's sharp eyes studied the scene, but there was no amusement there, only intent. The man set his paper aside. "I assume you know who you're speaking to," he asked Ms. Harrison. Her lips pursed. "Sir, this does not concern you," He smirked. Actually, it does. Because I happen to be a journalist. And what I just witnessed. He tapped his pen against the newspaper. That's a headline. James exhaled slowly, watching as the woman's face paled. Perhaps this flight would be more eventful than he had anticipated. James Carter had never been the kind of man to seek attention. He had spent his entire military career working behind the scenes, quietly doing his duty and expecting nothing in return. He had enlisted at 18, gone through grueling training, and served in some of the toughest regions of the world. His time in the military had shaped him, given him discipline, resilience, and a deep understanding of human nature. But now, after months overseas, all he wanted was to go home. The airport was a familiar place, yet no matter how many times he passed through it, there was always something exhausting about the endless waiting, the security checks, and the impersonal way travelers moved past one another like shadows. It was just another step in his journey, nothing more. James adjusted the strap on his duffel bag as he walked toward the gate. He could feel the weight of his uniform, more than just the fabric on his back, but the way people looked at him because of it. Some with admiration, some with curiosity, and others with something colder. He was used to it. As he approached the boarding area, he handed his ticket to the attendant at the counter. The woman barely looked up, glancing at his uniform but saying nothing. She scanned the ticket, printed another slip, and pushed it back across the counter. "Economy, seat 23B, she said flatly. James nodded and took the ticket without a word. He wasn't expecting special treatment, nor did he want it. He stepped aside, finding an empty seat near the window where he could watch the planes moving along the runway. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, glinting off the metal bodies of aircraft lined up like soldiers waiting for their turn to deploy. "Sir?" The voice was light, cheerful, and unmistakably directed at him. James turned to see a young woman standing nearby, her airline uniform neatly pressed, her blonde hair tucked into a professional bun. She had a brightness about her, a kindness that felt strangely out of place in the hurried chaos of the airport. "Are you flying with us today?" she asked, her smile genuine. "Yes, ma'am," James replied. She clasped her hands together. "Well, I just wanted to say thank you for your service. And actually, I was wondering if you'd let me upgrade you to first class. It's just a small way of showing appreciation." James raised an eyebrow, surprised. It wasn't the first time someone had thanked him for his service, but an upgrade to first class was something different. He shook his head. "That's mighty kind of you, miss, but I'm all right where I am." Mary's enthusiasm didn't waver. "Are you sure? It's not every day I get to do something nice for a soldier. And we do have an open seat. Just think of it as a way to get a little extra legroom," she added with a playful smile. James hesitated. He wasn't one to accept favors, but there was something about the way she offered it, not as charity, not as pity, but as genuine gratitude. "Well," he sighed, finally relenting, "I suppose if it's no trouble." Mary beamed. "No trouble at all. Let me take care of that for you." She took his ticket and disappeared for a moment. When she returned, she handed him a new boarding pass. "Here you go, first class, seat 4A. Enjoy your flight, Captain Carter." James nodded in thanks. "Much appreciated, Miss Mary." She grinned. "Just Mary is fine. And I hope you have a great flight." As the boarding call echoed through the terminal, James picked up his bag and made his way onto the plane. The first-class cabin was a world away from economy. The seats were wider, the space more open, and the air seemed quieter. He settled into 4A, stretching out his legs and letting himself relax, if only for a moment. Mary walked past, giving him a small smile as she helped another passenger. James exhaled, looking out the window as the last few travelers found their seats. It was a simple act of kindness, but in a world where people often overlook those who served, it meant something. He leaned back, closing his eyes for just a moment. He never saw the storm coming. James had barely settled into his first-class seat when he felt the weight of unwelcome eyes on him. He had seen this before, too many times to count. A few passengers cast lingering glances in his direction, some with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled disapproval. He pretended not to notice. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. The seat was comfortable, the extra space a luxury he rarely experienced. For a moment, he allowed himself to enjoy it. But that moment was fleeting. A sharp, clipped voice cut through the quiet hum of the first-class cabin. "Excuse me, what is going on here?" James turned his head slightly, catching sight of a middle-aged woman with a severe expression marching down the aisle. Her uniform was pristine, her hair neatly pinned in place, and the name tag on her chest read Ms. Harrison, Chief Flight Attendant. He knew that tone. He knew that look. Before he could respond, she had already turned to Mary, who stood just a few feet away, adjusting a tray on the counter. "Why is he in this seat?" Ms. Harrison's voice was firm, her words carrying the authority of someone who was used to giving orders. Mary straightened, keeping her professional demeanor. "I upgraded him, ma'am. He's a military officer, and I thought." "You thought?" Ms. Harrison cut her off, her voice sharpening. "That is not how things work here. Upgrades are for paying customers, not handouts." The entire section went quiet. James could feel the tension rising, like an unspoken weight pressing down on the air around them. He remained still, his posture relaxed but his jaw tight. Mary swallowed, glancing at James briefly before responding. "Ma'am, we had an extra seat available, and it was a small way to say thank you." "I don't care," Ms. Harrison snapped. "I don't care who he is. We have standards on this airline." There was a shift in her tone, a subtle but clear emphasis on the word standards. James had heard that word used like a weapon before. He had faced discrimination in ways both blatant and discreet. It came in different forms, sometimes spoken outright, other times hidden beneath layers of false professionalism. "I'm sorry," Ms. Harrison continued, this time turning to him. "But I'll have to ask you to return to your assigned seat in economy." James met her gaze, his face unreadable. He knew he had a choice in this moment. He could comply and move back to seat 23B like nothing had happened. Or he could make it clear that this was not okay. He took a slow breath before speaking. "With all due respect, ma'am, I was given this seat by your staff. I didn't ask for it. But now, it seems, I'm being told I don't belong here." Ms. Harrison's face tensed. "Sir, this is not about..." A voice interrupted her. "Excuse me." The words came from a few rows down. A man in his 50s, dressed in a tailored suit, had set aside his newspaper. His sharp eyes studied the scene with interest, though there was no amusement in his expression. "I couldn't help but overhear," he continued. "And I must say, this is a rather unfortunate situation for your airline." Ms. Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, this does not concern you." The man gave a slight smirk. "Oh, but it does. Because I happen to be a journalist. And what I just witnessed..." He tapped his pen against the paper. "That's a headline." The tension in the cabin shifted. Passengers, who had remained silent, suddenly seemed more interested in what was happening. A few exchanged looks. Others straightened in their seats. The atmosphere was no longer just awkward, it was charged. Ms. Harrison's face paled slightly. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice measured now, as if she was trying to undo the damage. But James had seen enough. He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. Every eye was on him. He wasn't angry, not in the way Ms. Harrison expected him to be. He was calm. Too calm. And that was far more unsettling. He turned to Mary first. "Thank you for your kindness. It means more than you know." Then he turned to Ms. Harrison. "I've served this country for 20 years. I've worn this uniform in places where my life was worth less than the ground I walked on. But I never expected to be treated as less than in my own country, on a flight I paid for. Ms. Harrison's jaw tightened. Sir, But James wasn't waiting for an apology that wasn't coming. He reached for his bag. That's when the journalist stood up too. Captain Carter, he said, his voice carrying across the cabin. If you don't mind, I'd love to get your full name. I have a feeling this story is just getting started. Ms. Harrison's expression changed entirely. The whispers among the passengers grew louder. Someone pulled out a phone. A woman in the back audibly gasped. James paused, then looked at the journalist. He nodded. Captain James Carter. The journalist scribbled something down. And you served where? James met his gaze. Afghanistan. Iraq. And a few places I can't talk about. That got the attention of more people. Miss Harrison seemed to sense that she was losing control of the situation. Sir, please, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. James tilted his head. More difficult? For who? The silence that followed was deafening. Mary, who had been standing frozen in place, suddenly stepped forward. Captain Carter, she said, her voice shaking just slightly. You don't have to move. I'll handle this. But before she could say another word, another flight attendant, one of Ms. Harrison's senior staff, whispered something in her ear. Ms. Harrison's expression hardened. Then, with a clipped tone, she finally said, Fine. Stay in the seat. The tension broke, just slightly. But James knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He settled back into his seat, but he didn't relax. Because he knew, just as well as everyone in the room, that by the time this flight landed, the whole country would know what happened here. The rest of the flight was eerily quiet. James remained in his first-class seat, his expression unreadable, though inside, his thoughts raced. He wasn't a man who picked fights. He had spent years learning patience, understanding that in many situations, silence was a weapon more powerful than words. But what had happened today wasn't something he could just brush off. Across the aisle, the journalist, Michael Reynolds, watched him carefully, occasionally jotting down notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Every now and then, Michael would glance at the other passengers, gauging their reactions. Some looked uneasy, pretending to be engrossed in their in-flight entertainment. Others whispered to their seatmates, sneaking glances at James when they thought he wasn't looking. But James saw everything. Mary, the flight attendant who had started all of this simply by being kind, walked by several times, checking in on passengers. Each time, she would glance at James, as if silently apologizing for the mess she hadn't intended to create. Ms. Harrison, however, kept her distance. She had retreated to the galley, occasionally peeking out but avoiding eye contact with both James and Michael. She knew she had made a mistake. And so, she did what many in her position did, she tried to pretend it never happened. But James knew better. This wasn't over. 2 hours later, the plane touched down. The announcement came over the speakers, instructing passengers to remain seated as they taxied to the gate. James barely moved, keeping his hands folded on his lap, his expression calm but his mind focused. As soon as the seatbelt light turned off, Michael leaned toward him. Captain Carter, he said quietly. Can I have a few minutes of your time once we disembark? James studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. Sure. Michael smiled slightly, as if he already knew how important this moment would become. The terminal was crowded as passengers made their way toward baggage claim. James walked with practiced ease, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Michael followed closely behind, his notebook in one hand, his phone in the other. Mary approached them near the exit, her face lined with concern. Captain Carter, she said softly. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. This wasn't supposed to happen. James offered her a small, reassuring smile. You have nothing to apologize for, Miss Mary. You did what was right. She exhaled, relief flashing across her face. I don't know what's going to happen now. Miss Harrison, she's been with the airline for years. She hesitated, lowering her voice. I don't want to lose my job over this. Michael, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. You might want to brace yourself. This is going to get a lot bigger than just one flight. Mary bit her lip, clearly nervous. James reached out and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. No matter what happens, you did the right thing. That matters. She nodded and stepped back, watching as James and Michael made their way toward a quieter corner of the terminal. Michael pulled out his phone. Mind if I record this? James raised an eyebrow. You planning to put this in your article? Michael smirked. You kidding? This isn't just an article. This is a national story. James thought about that for a moment. Then, he nodded. Michael hit record. Can you walk me through what happened, Captain Carter? James exhaled, thinking back to the moment it all started. It was simple, really. A flight attendant, Mary, offered to upgrade my seat. I didn't ask for it. She said it was a small way to show appreciation for my service. Michael nodded. And you accepted? Eventually, James said. I'm not the kind of man who looks for special treatment. But she insisted, and I could tell she was genuine about it. So I agreed. And then Ms. Harrison got involved. James gave a slow nod. She wasn't happy. She made it clear that first-class seats were for paying customers. That they weren't for handouts. Michael narrowed his eyes. And you felt that comment was directed at you specifically? James met his gaze. Wouldn't you? Michael didn't answer right away. Instead, he scribbled something in his notebook. Did she ever mention your race outright? No, James said. She didn't have to. It was in the way she looked at me. The way she emphasized certain words. I've been in situations like this before, Mr. Reynolds. I know what it looks like. And I know what it feels like. Michael nodded slowly. And what do you want to happen now? James was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. I don't want free flights. I don't want a public apology from the airline just because they got caught. I want something real to come from this. Not just for me, but for every person who gets treated like they don't belong. Michael tapped his pen against his notebook. You realize this is going to explode, right? James gave him a knowing look. I figured as much. Michael smiled slightly, shaking his head. You military guys. Always so damn calm. James chuckled. I've been through worse than this, Mr. Reynolds. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let it slide. Michael clicked off the recorder. I'm publishing this first thing in the morning. And something tells me you'll be getting a lot of phone calls after that. James simply nodded. I'll be ready. They shook hands. And just like that, the truth was set free. James Carter didn't expect to wake up a national headline. By the time he had settled back home, had a quiet dinner, and finally rested after months away, his phone had already started buzzing nonstop. Calls from unknown numbers, texts from friends and old military colleagues, and emails from journalists flooded in. He wasn't on social media, but his niece was. And when she called him the next morning, her voice was electric with shock. Uncle James, you're everywhere, she nearly shouted. What are you talking about? James rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The article. That journalist, Michael Reynolds, he published the story this morning. And it's gone viral. James sat up, suddenly more awake. Viral? Yeah. It's all over the news. People are furious. Celebrities are posting about it, politicians are commenting, and the airline's getting destroyed online. James exhaled, already knowing he had a long day ahead. By noon, his phone rang again. Michael Reynolds. I take it you've seen the reaction, Michael said, not bothering with pleasantries. James chuckled dryly. Heard about it. Haven't read a word yet. Michael sighed. Well, let's just say you're the most talked about man in America right now. The airline released a generic apology, but it's not enough. People want real accountability. James leaned against the kitchen counter. What does real accountability look like? Michael's voice sharpened. It looks like them actually changing their policies instead of sweeping this under the rug. He paused. It also looks like Ms. Harrison losing her job. James wasn't a man who enjoyed seeing others punished, even those who had done him wrong. But he also knew that people like Ms. Harrison only changed when they were forced to. Michael continued, they're offering you a lifetime first-class membership as an apology. James let out a low laugh. They really think throwing free flights at me is going to fix this? That's exactly what they think, Michael replied. That's why I haven't answered them yet. What do you want to do? James was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said, I'll tell you what I don't want. I don't want this to turn into just another scandal people forget about in a week. I don't need free plane tickets. I need this airline and every airline to actually change. To make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Michael nodded through the phone. That's what I was hoping you'd say. James sighed. So, what's next? Michael grinned. Next? You're going on TV. James closed his eyes and shook his head. Damn it. 3 days later, James Carter was sitting under the bright lights of a national morning show. The host, a polished woman in her 50s with the kind of presence that commanded attention, smiled as the cameras rolled. Today, we have a story that has sparked national conversation. A decorated U.S. military officer, Captain James Carter, was humiliated on a flight simply for existing in first class. James had never liked being in the spotlight, but he understood the importance of this moment. The host turned to him. Captain Carter, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me, James replied, his voice steady. You could have walked away from this, taken the airline's apology, and let it go. But you didn't. Why? James took a breath. Because this isn't about me. I have thick skin. I've been through worse. But what about the next person? What about a young black man or woman who gets treated the same way and doesn't have a journalist sitting nearby to call it out? The host nodded. You're saying this isn't just an isolated incident? No, ma'am, James said firmly. It never is. The interview continued, with James calmly recounting what had happened. When asked about Ms. Harrison, he didn't gloat or call for revenge. I don't know Ms. Harrison personally, he said. But I do know that what she did wasn't just about me. It was about an attitude, a mindset that says some people belong and others don't. That's what needs to change. By the time the segment ended, the airline was in full damage control mode. A statement was released. Then another. And then, finally, the CEO himself made a public apology. We deeply regret the experience Captain Carter had on our flight. Effective immediately, we are launching a full review of our first-class upgrade policies and mandatory anti-bias training for all flight staff. That same day, Ms. Harrison was fired. And Mary? She was offered a promotion. A week after the story broke, James was sitting on his front porch when a familiar number flashed on his phone. Mary. He answered. Well, if it isn't my favorite troublemaker. She laughed. Captain Carter. I just wanted to say thank you. For what? James asked. For speaking up. For not letting them bury this. She paused. I got promoted. James smiled. You deserved it. Mary hesitated. You know, I was scared. When this all started, I thought I was going to lose my job. I thought no one would back me up. But now, I realize something. Doing the right thing is scary, but staying silent is worse. James nodded. That's something worth remembering. Later that night, Michael Reynolds published his final article on the matter. It wasn't just about James. It was about every person who had been told, in ways big or small, that they didn't belong. It was about what happens when someone finally says, enough. And as the country moved forward, one thing was clear: this wasn't just another news cycle story. This was a moment of change. And James Carter? He would always stand for what was right. The world moves fast. Scandals break, outrage spreads, and within days, something new takes its place. But this time, something was different. A week passed. Then two. Yet, the story of Captain James Carter didn't fade. People still talked about it. News outlets kept covering it. The airline industry, once silent, now faced mounting pressure from advocacy groups and lawmakers demanding policy reforms. And then, the moment James had been waiting for arrived. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, announced mandatory anti-bias training for all airline employees nationwide. Major airlines followed suit, publicly declaring policy changes to prevent discrimination in first-class upgrades and cabin assignments. For the first time, this wasn't just another forgotten injustice. It was real change. James didn't seek recognition. He never wanted fame. But as he walked through an airport a month later, he noticed something had shifted. A black couple stood near the first-class boarding gate, no hesitation, no glances of doubt. A young Latina woman in an airline uniform smiled as she assisted an elderly veteran, her gesture one of pure kindness, not forced politeness. And then, there was the quiet moment that sealed it. As James passed by a group of flight attendants preparing for a flight, one of them, an older man with graying hair, caught his eye and nodded. A small nod. But it meant everything. James nodded back. The world wasn't perfect. It never would be. But sometimes, a single voice could shift the tide. Sometimes, one act of courage could set things in motion. And sometimes, the fight was worth it. Now, let's talk about you. How many times have you seen something wrong and said nothing? How many times have you thought, it's not my place to speak up, or it won't change anything? James Carter could have done the same. He could have moved back to seat 23B and let it go. But he didn't. Because when good people stay silent, nothing changes. This isn't just James' story. This is our story. A story about fairness. About dignity. About standing up even when it's easier to sit down. So the next time you see something unjust, whether it's on a flight, in a store, or anywhere in life, ask yourself, will I stay silent? Or will I speak up? Because change doesn't happen by itself. It happens when we make it happen. And if a single moment of courage could change an entire industry, imagine what could happen if we all did our part. The story of Captain James Carter is a powerful reminder that standing up for dignity and fairness is never just about one person, it's about shaping the world for those who come after us. Discrimination, in any form, doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it hides behind policies, unspoken rules, and societal norms that quietly tell people they don't belong. But change doesn't happen when we ignore these moments, it happens when we choose courage over comfort. As we grow older, we have the wisdom and life experience to know that silence in the face of injustice is a choice, and it is never the right one. Whether it's in the small acts of kindness we extend or the moments we decide to speak up when something isn't right, we each have the power to shape the values of the next generation. Captain Carter didn't seek the spotlight, but his decision to demand respect, not just for himself, but for all who might face the same prejudice, became a force for change. His story teaches us that it is never too late, and we are never too old, to make a difference. The world changes when we refuse to accept anything less than fairness, respect, and justice.